take us from his beginning, because I know he did a lot of work that you touched on at CBS, and then how he ended up with Orson.
It is a fun story. He was born in New York in 1911, and by the time he was a teenager, he was this incredibly, already extremely knowledgeable music student who loved rare, obscure composers that are now rather commonplace, and befriended an avant-garde American composer named Charles Ives, some of you may have heard of, and Herrmann was a great champion of Ives' music, and Ives is now very recognized as an important American composer. And it was Ives who I think really showed Herrmann to follow your own path, to ignore what other people say. Believe in yourself. So Herrmann found his own voice as a composer, that classic Bernard Herrmann sound that we hear, he had by his 20s. And fortunately, radio was a new medium in 1933 when he walked in the door and was hired as a staff composer conductor at CBS Radio, because all those radio dramas needed music.
Right.
And it was there that he met someone 4 years his junior, Orson Welles, who was even more audacious than he. And John Houseman, who produced Welles's Mercury Theatre on the Air show, had a great sentence that he wrote in his autobiography. Houseman said that of the two men, between the throwing of scores and the breaking of batons, Orson and Benny came to understand each other perfectly. And it was a case of, it was like a stormy marriage that ended in hugs constantly.
Yeah.
And they were great collaborators, and I think Welles would happily have had Herrmann score all of his films if Welles had been able to keep his films through post-production, but as any Orson Welles people know, Welles would lose control. Well, in 1938, when things were still good and they were both at CBS and these Tyrols in their 20s, Welles produced a radio broadcast called The War of the Worlds, which was rewritten at the last moment to be done as a series of simulated news bulletins of a Martian invasion that scared a great deal of the East Coast, especially, and perhaps in some areas in the middle of the country when communication was much simpler and we didn't have the internet to check these things. And that notoriety catapulted Welles to Hollywood with that amazing contract that essentially let him do whatever he wanted. And he said, I want this guy in New York who's never scored a film to write the music for my movie, Bernard Herrmann. And that's how Herrmann's career started in film. And Herrmann was very wary of everyone in Hollywood from the beginning. I mean, Kane was a great experience, like Hangover Square. He was on it from the beginning. Herrmann said that the famous last sequence in Kane revealing what Rosebud is was actually shot to pre-recorded music, so the timing would be perfect. I mean, that kind of unusual innovation
all the
was done.
innovations on Kane.
And his second film was a great fantasy film, which I highly recommend you watch on DVD if you haven't seen, The Devil and Daniel Webster.
I was going to ask you about that because that is a film that almost nobody remembers, and it has probably the greatest performance by one of the best screen actors of the 20th century, Walter Houston.
Yes.
And
as the devil.
As the devil, yes, old Scratch. And it also Herrmann won the Oscar for it.
That's right.
It's almost a trivia question.
His second film score, this outsider who felt that nobody in Hollywood liked him, well, they gave him the Academy Award for his second score. He never won again, but he did win for his second score, and from then on would score about one film a year, and Hangover Square was done, as I mentioned, in 1944. And a fun little piece of trivia about this is that musicians among you may have noticed that when you see those close-ups of Laird Krieger's hand playing the beginning of the concerto and certain of the octaves, the descending da-da-da-da, going down the half tones, is musically correct. He is actually playing the right notes. He studied, he clearly was a pianist to some extent, and when this film was released in 1945, among the audience was a 15-year-old music student who sat in the theater over and over so he could watch the concerto sequence and memorize as much of it as possible. And that was 15-year-old Stephen Sondheim, who wrote a fan letter to Bernard Herrmann and received a very gracious reply from Herrmann encouraging him. And Sondheim has said many times since that, one, he can still play the first 8 bars of the Hangover Square Concerto by memory, and secondly, that Sweeney Todd, his Broadway show, was essentially inspired by the music of Bernard Herrmann. And so next time you listen to Sweeney Todd, you'll hear, I think, not that he's imitating him, but it's the kind of musical vocabulary and some of the harmonics and murders accompanied by high-pitched woodwinds and things. He's clearly paying homage to both Herrmann and Hangover Square.
How did he meet Hitchcock and start their association?
Well, they didn't work together until November of '54 on a movie called The Trouble with Harry, which Herrmann considered the black humor of which he thought was a perfect visualization of Hitchcock's personality. Mm-hmm. And years later, Herrmann arranged a really delightful suite of his score for The Trouble with Harry, and he called it A Portrait of Hitch, and it is really a lovely piece of work and a tribute to him. But I discovered going through Herrmann's papers, and parenthetically, I was very lucky at the age of 20 to discover that there was no book about Bernard Herrmann, and that those who knew him said, let me tell you some stories about Bernard Herrmann. They didn't care that I was 19, 20, 21 years old. They told me these amazing stories, so that became the book. And when I didn't hear from his widow, I convinced my dad to finally go to my first trip to London and sat in the lobby of the BBC, where she was a producer until she came out, and just told her that I was waiting. And she came out, and she just wasn't ready at that time to think about him again after his death. It was still such a painful memory, losing him. And then she came out and she said, I'm so sorry, I would love to cooperate with you. And she's been a second mother to me ever since. She turned 75 last week, and she let me basically move into her home in Britain and unpack all of his papers and belongings. And I found a letter from Hitchcock, a letter from Stravinsky, a letter from Vaughan Williams, a letter from Orson Welles, all of which, his diary, all of which is in the book. So in those papers, when Herrmann was visiting Hollywood in 1942 from New York, he said, there's just a sentence that says something like, met Hitchcock at the Brown Derby, we both agreed we should work together sometime. And it didn't happen for another 12 years, but then of course that launched the series that led to Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, these incredible collaborations where those films would not be the films they are without those scores.
Yeah. Now, the end of their relationship, why did Herrmann and Hitchcock have that rupture?
Well, on a film appropriately named Torn Curtain, released in 1966, a very sad end happened to a very happy collaboration, because Herrmann considered Hitchcock a dear friend after 12 years of collaboration, traveled together across the country for research on things. So they were very close, but Herrmann did become a more difficult and temperamental person in general, and Hitchcock, we know, really didn't like any kind of conflict or anything. I don't think Herrmann blew up at Hitchcock often, but trends were changing, and as I mentioned, pop music, theme songs, rock and roll, all those things were much more common in the 60s, and you had some composers like Henry Mancini, who was brilliant at both. He could write the score for Breakfast at Tiffany's and also give you Moon River in the same score.
Right.
Well, that's what Universal wanted from Hitchcock movies by the mid-60s, because the box office wasn't good on Marnie, which Herrmann and Hitchcock had just worked on together, and the knives were sort of out for Hitchcock, because he had some...
You're only as good as your last movie.
That's right. And some people were ready to see
that has never changed and never will change.
So a lot of pressure was put on Hitchcock to have a commercially exploitable score for Torn Curtain, which everybody realized kind of by the time it was being put together was not all that good a movie. And many a film that didn't turn out too well, the composer is the person who walks the plank because the music has to save everything. Well, when Benny and Hitch had made Psycho in 1960, Hitchcock had said, as he usually did, as he always did with Herrmann, do whatever you want. My one request is don't write any music for the shower scene. I just want the sound of the knife and screams and the water. So Herrmann nodded, and then he wrote music for the shower scene. And knowing, and this was this was how great their relationship was, that at the scoring stage he said, by the way, Hitch, I did write music for that scene. You don't have to use it, but let me play it for you. And they had recorded it, and they played the playback. And as Benny liked to tell it, Hitchcock said, well, of course we'll use that music. And Herrmann said, but I thought you said you didn't want music. To which Hitchcock said, improper suggestion, my boy. They're both about 50 at that point.
Yeah.
Anyway, when Torn Curtain came around, and Hitch said in a rather vague way in a telegram that he wanted a beat score from Herrmann, which clearly meant something jazzy and just so out of Bernard Herrmann's wheelhouse. Herrmann interpreted that as beat as in Shostakovich, because it was a movie about the Iron Curtain and being in the Soviet bloc, and he wrote this very harsh, dissonant score that would have made the movie much better. Hitchcock walked on the stage, heard what had been composed so far, and I'm sorry to say, fired Herrmann on the spot after all those years. He didn't do it away from anyone else. I mean, it might have been done aside.
He dismissed the orchestra.
He dismissed the orchestra and said, go home. And it was such a devastating event, and that really sealed Herrmann's fate in Hollywood, that when his greatest patron had, and it was a rather humiliating thing to do, and I think, and Hitchcock, to give him his, to see it from his perspective, he put himself on the line and said, well, I want Bernard Herrmann for this, but it was a real showdown to something that was inevitable, and it's really unfortunate.
I recall Norman telling me that after the fact, Herrmann came to him as kind of an intermediary and say, could you talk to him?
That very day, he called him.
The same day. He said, could you talk to him? And they met at a hamburger joint owned by Jerry Wald's son. I mean, Norman, with his memory, he probably remembered what he had on the hamburger. At any rate, and I asked Norman, I said, did you do it? He said, absolutely not. Because Hitch would have been very much offended. And then I said to him, which would have affected your relationship with Hitchcock? And he said, you're catching on, Alan.
Yes.
So it was over.
And they had one brief phone conversation after that. And then the poignant thing is that Benny kept trying to at least heal it on a personal level, because he loved Hitchcock and he spoke well of him publicly. He didn't do what many people would do now and go to the press and he wrote that Portrait of Hitch suite based on Trouble with Harry and recorded it after all this happened. And then he even visited Hitchcock at Hitchcock's office during a visit to Los Angeles, and so he really tried. But Hitchcock was having none of it. When Hitchcock was done with someone,
it was the end.
The door had closed.
It was the end.